Of all the grandchildren of Queen Victoria, that sprawling dynastic web that stretched across every throne in Europe, none had a story quite so strange, so tragic, and so profoundly disturbing as the boy she called her darling grandchild. He was born a British prince, raised in the cozy, ordered world of the English aristocracy, and destined for a life of quiet privilege. Yet, he would die a convicted Nazi, stripped of his titles, his fortune gone, his name a byword for betrayal. How does a boy who played in the halls of Windsor Castle end up shaking hands with Adolf Hitler? How does Queen Victoria's favorite grandson become a high-ranking officer in the infamous brown shirts? His life intertwined with the darkest regime of the 20th century? This isn't a simple story of a man caught on the wrong side of history. It's a complex psychological drama about identity, duty, and catastrophic moral failure. It is the story of Prince Charles Edward, Duke of Albany, and Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, a man who was born a prince but died a pariah, forever trapped between the country of his birth and the country he chose to serve. To understand Charles Edward, you have to picture the world he was born into in 1884. This was the zenith of the British Empire, and at its heart was a vast interconnected family of royals, with Queen Victoria as its formidable matriarch. Her children and grandchildren were chess pieces in a great game of dynastic diplomacy, their marriages binding the Protestant ruling houses of Europe, especially those of Britain and Germany. They were cousins who ruled empires, a family business that spanned a continent. Charles Edward's place in this world was both privileged and poignant. His father was Prince Leopold, Duke of Albany, Queen Victoria's youngest and most intellectual son. Tragically, Leopold suffered from hemophilia and died from a fall just a few months before Charles Edward was born. And so from his very first breath, the boy inherited his father's titles: Duke of Albany, Earl of Clarence, Baron Arklow, and a life tinged with sadness. He was a prince who would never know his father. He grew up in the idyllic surroundings of Claremont House in Surrey, England. By all accounts, it was a warm and happy childhood, presided over by his loving but strict mother, Princess Helen of Waldeck, and Piermont. His closest companion was his sister Alice, just a year and a half older. They were inseparable, so close they were nicknamed the Siamese twins. But the most important figure in his young life was his grandmother, the Queen Empress herself. Victoria doted on him. He was a frequent visitor to Windsor and Osborne House, a sensitive, handsome, blue-eyed boy who charmed the aging monarch. He was raised as a quintessential upper-class Englishman. He was given his first ceremonial post in a Scottish regiment, the Seaforth Highlanders, as a small boy. Later, he was sent to Eton College, the crucible of the British elite, where he was reportedly very happy. He was, by all accounts, being groomed for the life of a minor British royal, a life of country estates, military ceremonies, and comfortable obscurity. He was small, high-strung, and perhaps a little fragile, but his path seemed clear. That is, until fate and the complex rules of German royal succession intervened. In 1899, when Charles Edward was just 15, his world was turned upside down. A single telegram arrived, and the comfortable, predictable future he had known was shattered forever. The telegram that changed Charles Edward's life came from Germany. His uncle, Alfred, Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, and also Queen Victoria's second son, had just lost his own and only son to suicide. According to the intricate laws of succession for the German duchy, a new heir was needed. The next in line was another of Victoria's sons, the Duke of Connaught, but he and his own son renounced their claim. They had no desire to leave England and rule a small German state. And so, the line of succession fell directly upon the shoulders of the 15-year-old schoolboy at Eton, Charles Edward. He was horrified. His immediate, unfiltered reaction was quoted as, "I have to go and become a beastly German prince." His mother was equally dismayed. But the will of his grandmother, Queen Victoria, and the weight of dynastic duty were absolute. The decision was made. The young British prince was to be uprooted from the only home he had ever known and transplanted to Germany, to be re-educated, reshaped, and Germanized. He was considered young enough, pliable enough, to be molded into a suitable ruler for a German duchy. The process was overseen by his powerful and famously bombastic cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. The Kaiser took a personal interest in his young charge, determined to transform the quiet English boy into a proper Prussian officer. Charles Edward was whisked away from the playing fields of Eton and plunged into the rigid, unforgiving world of the Prussian Central Cadet Academy at Lichterfelde, near Berlin. It was a brutal culture shock. He was forced to learn German, study military science, and endure the harsh discipline of a system designed to forge soldiers, not nurture sensitive teenagers. He was desperately homesick and unhappy. The Kaiser, in his own way, tried to help, becoming a sort of surrogate father. He took such an interest in the boy's development that Charles Edward became known around the imperial court as the Emperor's seventh son. But Wilhelm's mentorship was a poisoned chalice. He indoctrinated the impressionable boy with his own worldview, a toxic mix of fervent German nationalism, contempt for parliamentary democracy, and a simmering anti-Semitism. Charles Edward found his time in Berlin miserable. The Kaiser, prone to mood swings, often bullied and belittled him, seemingly resentful of the boy's English roots. On July 30th, 1900, his uncle Alfred died, and the teenager officially became the reigning Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Because he was still a minor, a regent was appointed to rule in his name until he came of age. In 1901, he attended his grandmother, Queen Victoria's funeral, a deeply conflicted figure, dressed not in the uniform of his British regiment, but in the uniform of the Prussian hussars. He was caught between two worlds belonging fully to neither. His cousin, the new British king, Edward VII, tried to maintain the connection, making him a Knight of the Garter in 1902, but the pull of his new life was relentless. He studied law at the University of Bonn and was tutored in the mechanics of government. He was, by all accounts, a conscientious young man who genuinely tried to embrace his new role. He developed a keen interest in art, music, and new technology like automobiles and airships. To his new subjects in the small, charming Duchy of Coburg, he became a popular figure, a handsome young ruler who took his duties seriously. Yet, the feeling of being an outsider never truly left him. His continued ties to Britain, his love for his Scottish terriers, and his very English demeanor were sources of suspicion among the German elite. He was a man with a divided heart, and that division would soon be tested by the fires of war. On July 19, 1905, on his 21st birthday, Charles Edward assumed full constitutional power as the Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Now a man, it was time for him to marry and secure the dynasty. The bride chosen for him was Princess Victoria Adelaide of Schleswig-Holstein, a niece of the German Empress. The match was arranged, and one of its key qualifications was that Victoria Adelaide had no non-German or Jewish lineage, a chilling indicator of the racial thinking already prevalent in German aristocratic circles. Their marriage was dutiful, and they had 5 children, 2 daughters and 3 sons. Though the children became fluent in German, English remained the primary language spoken in the privacy of their home at Windsor Castle. It was a small, persistent echo of the Duke's other life. As a ruler, Charles Edward was conservative. his political views deeply colored by the nationalism his cousin the Kaiser had instilled in him. He was a great patron of the arts and oversaw the restoration of the magnificent Vesta Coburg, the fortress that looms over the town. He remained a vast local landowner with an enormous personal fortune. He traveled frequently, often visiting Britain, trying to maintain the delicate balance of his dual identity. But in the summer of 1914, that balance became impossible. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand ignited the First World War, pitting Britain and its allies against Germany and the Central Powers. For Charles Edward, the moment of ultimate choice had arrived. He was a British prince and a reigning German duke. He could not be both. The conflict of loyalty that had defined his entire adult life now demanded a final public and brutal resolution. He made his choice. He sided with Germany. He didn't just passively accept his duty. He embraced it with the zeal of a convert. He publicly denounced his birth country, accusing Britain of attacking Germany. He renounced his honorary position as Colonel-in-Chief of the Seaforth Highlanders, in a gesture of profound contempt for his British family. Instead of returning the British military honors he had been given, he sold them. He cut off all contact with his royal relatives in Britain and Belgium. The boy who had been Queen Victoria's darling had become Britain's sworn enemy. Because of a permanent leg injury from a skiing accident, he was unable to fight on the front lines. He was what some derisively called a chocolate soldier, spending most of his time behind the lines, visiting his Coburg troops and dining in officers' messes. But he was present on the Western Front and personally witnessed the infamous sack of Dinant, a brutal massacre of Belgian civilians by German soldiers. He received the Iron Cross for his bravery. Back in Britain, he was publicly condemned as a traitor. The press lumped him in with other traitor dukes who had sided with the enemy. In 1915, his cousin, King George V, grimly ordered his name to be struck from the register of the Knights of the Garter. 2 years later, as anti-German sentiment reached a fever pitch, the king changed the British royal family's name from the German-sounding Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to the solidly English House of Windsor. The same year, Parliament passed the Titles Deprivation Act, beginning the legal process to strip Charles Edward of his British peerages. His assets in Britain, worth millions, were seized. The door to his past had been slammed shut and locked forever. He was now unequivocally German. But the country he had sacrificed everything for was about to lose the war, and his world was about to collapse for a second time. The end of the First World War in November 1918 brought not peace but revolution to Germany. The Kaiser was forced to abdicate, and monarchies across the German Empire were swept away by a tide of republicanism. On November 14th, Charles Edward was deposed. Unlike his defiant stand against Britain, here he went quietly. He did not formally abdicate, but he was powerless. At just 34 years old, he was once again a private citizen, a duke without a duchy. This second great rupture in his life seems to have broken something within him. The post-war years in the Weimar Republic were a time of political turmoil, economic chaos, and national humiliation. For a man like Charles Edward, steeped in militarism and autocratic values, the new democratic Germany was an object of contempt. He became paranoid, terrified of a communist revolution, like the one that had murdered his Romanov relatives in Russia. He felt betrayed and adrift. His German subjects, who had once admired him, now had a new name for him. The left-wing press mockingly called him Herr Albany, a constant public reminder of the English heritage he had so violently renounced. This profound sense of grievance pushed him towards the darkest corners of German politics. He became actively involved with the far right, supporting a host of nationalist and paramilitary organizations. These were violent, anti-democratic groups who dreamed of restoring Germany's honor through force. He gave them money, lent them his prestigious name, and even sheltered wanted right-wing terrorists in his castles. He became a vocal supporter of the racist and anti-Semitic Völkisch movement. Then, on October 14, 1922, his path crossed with that of an obscure, rabble-rousing politician named Adolf Hitler. Hitler and his fledgling Nazi party held a rally in Coburg. Charles Edward attended a dinner hosted for the party, and at its conclusion, he stood up and shook Adolf Hitler's hand. He became the first German aristocrat to publicly endorse the future dictator. For Hitler, it was a massive propaganda coup. For Charles Edward, it was the beginning of his final catastrophic fall from grace. He was drawn to the Nazis' fierce anti-communism, their promise to restore German military might, and their authoritarian vision. He began funding the party, and in 1932, a swastika was added to the tower of his beloved Kallenberg Castle. That same year, at the wedding of his daughter Sibylla to the Crown Prince of Sweden, the town of Coburg was draped in both Swedish and Nazi flags. Adolf Hitler and Hermann Göring were honored guests. The former British prince was now fully enmeshed with the Nazi elite. When Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, Charles Edward's commitment to the Nazi cause became official. He formally joined the Nazi Party and was made an Obergruppenführer in the SA, the party's notorious paramilitary wing, the Brown Shirts. He was lavished with ceremonial titles and positions, becoming a prominent and highly visible symbol of the regime. He was, for Hitler, the perfect tool, a man with impeccable royal connections throughout Europe, who could lend a veneer of aristocratic respectability to a movement of thugs. In 1934, he publicly declared that he would forever blindly follow Hitler. One of his most significant roles was as president of the German Red Cross. Under his leadership, the humanitarian organization was perverted to serve the Nazi state's goals. It became a militarized support system for the army, and its principles were twisted to align with Nazi racial ideology. In 1935, Charles Edward used his position to orchestrate a carefully controlled visit for the president of the International Red Cross to the Dachau concentration camp. It was a cynical exercise in propaganda, designed to hide the camp's true horrors from the world. His complicity went even deeper. He served on the board of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, a scientific body that was instrumental in promoting the Nazis' horrific eugenics policies. It is believed he was aware of the so-called euthanasia program, the systematic murder of disabled people, which even claimed the life of a distant member of his own extended family. The Nazis also used him extensively as an unofficial diplomat. He was their royal ambassador, sent on missions around the world to leverage his family ties. He was especially crucial in their efforts to cultivate a pro-German faction within the British aristocracy. He made numerous trips to Britain in the 1930s, meeting with politicians like Neville Chamberlain and socializing with members of his estranged family, including the future King Edward VIII, who was known for his Nazi sympathies. He hosted the Duke and Duchess of Windsor during their infamous 1937 tour of Germany. He met with Mussolini in Italy, and in 1940 even traveled to the United States, where he had a deeply uncomfortable meeting with President Franklin D. Roosevelt at the White House. A particularly chilling incident from 1942 reveals the depths of his moral corruption. He was asked by a Swedish royal relative to intervene on behalf of Martha Lieberman, the elderly Jewish widow of the famous German painter Max Liebermann. she was slated for deportation. Charles Edward, the powerful president of the German Red Cross, with direct access to the highest levels of the regime, did nothing. Martha Lieberman, receiving her deportation notice, took her own life rather than face the horrors of the camps. Charles Edward's support for Nazism was not passive. It was active, willing, and by the end absolute. A significant aspect of Charles Edward's wartime experience was the military service of his 3 sons in the Wehrmacht, the unified armed forces of Nazi Germany. As a father, he encouraged their participation, seeing it as both a duty to the fatherland and a continuation of the family's aristocratic tradition of military service. His sons, Johann Leopold, born 1906, Hubertus, born 1909, and Ernst, born 1914, were all of age to serve, and their enlistment reflected the Duke's deep integration into the Nazi military ethos. The Wehrmacht, comprising the Heer, Army, Kriegsmarine, Navy, and Luftwaffe, Air Force, was the primary fighting force of Germany, and noble families like the Saxe-Coburgs were expected to contribute sons to its ranks as a sign of loyalty. Johann Leopold, the eldest, had already distanced himself from the line of succession by marrying unequally in 1932, but he served in the Wehrmacht during the war, surviving the conflict and later living in Austria. Ernst, the youngest son, also served, primarily in administrative or less combat-intensive roles, and he too survived the war, eventually settling in West Germany. However, it was the middle son, Hubertus, who became the focal point of the family's wartime tragedy. Born on March 24, 1909, Hubertus was Charles Edward's favorite, often described as the most promising and dutiful of the children. He embodied the ideals his father held dear: loyalty, discipline, and a sense of aristocratic obligation. Hubertus joined the Wehrmacht early in the war, serving as an officer in the infantry. His assignments took him to various fronts, but by 1943, he was deployed to the Eastern Front, where Germany was engaged in a brutal, attritional campaign against the Soviet Union. The Eastern Front was the deadliest theater of World War II, accounting for millions of casualties on both sides, with harsh conditions exacerbated by extreme weather, supply shortages, and fierce combat. Hubertus's unit was involved in defensive operations as the German army faced mounting Soviet offensives following the defeats at Stalingrad and Kursk. On November 9, 1943, Hubertus was killed in action near Mosty in what is now Ukraine. He was 34 years old at the time of his death. The circumstances of his demise were typical of the Eastern Front's chaos, likely involving artillery fire or direct combat during a Soviet advance. His body was recovered and buried in a military cemetery, though the exact location has been subject to post-war relocations due to changing borders and memorial policies. The loss was a profound personal blow to Charles Edward, who had invested great hopes in Hubertus as the heir apparent to the family legacy. Diaries and correspondence from the period indicate the Duke's grief was intense, with reports of him withdrawing from social engagements and focusing more intently on his official duties as a coping mechanism. Despite this tragedy, there is no indication that Hubertus's death caused Charles Edward to question his allegiance to Hitler or the Nazi regime. On the contrary, it appears to have reinforced his resolve. In the Nazi worldview, the sacrifice of young men on the Eastern Front was glorified as a heroic defense against Bolshevik barbarism, and Charles Edward, steeped in this propaganda, likely viewed his son's death as a noble contribution to the cause. He continued his high-level involvement in Nazi organizations, including the German Red Cross, without any documented wavering. This steadfastness underscores the depth of his ideological commitment, where personal loss was subordinated to the perceived greater good of the Reich. The service of Charles Edward's sons in the Wehrmacht was not unusual among German nobility. Many aristocratic families, including those with ties to former ruling houses, contributed officers to the military, seeing it as a continuation of their traditional role in society. The Wehrmacht itself was a professional force that, while increasingly Nazified, maintained a degree of separation from the SS and other party militias. However, by 1943 the lines had blurred, with the army deeply implicated in war crimes on the Eastern Front, including the Holocaust and reprisals against civilians. There is no specific evidence linking Charles Edward's sons to atrocities, but their participation in the war effort placed them within a system responsible for widespread devastation. In the same year as Hubertus's death, 1943, Charles Edward played a prominent role in one of the Nazi regime's most cynical propaganda efforts, the investigation of the Katyn Forest Massacre. This event involved the discovery of mass graves containing the bodies of thousands of Polish officers and intellectuals executed by the Soviet NKVD in 1940. The Nazis, who uncovered the graves in April 1943 after invading Soviet territory, sought to exploit the atrocity to drive a wedge between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union, as well as to deflect attention from their own crimes. At Hitler's direct request, Charles Edward, in his capacity as president of the German Red Cross, Deutsches Rotes Kreuz, demanded an international investigation into the massacre. The DRK under Nazi control had been transformed from a humanitarian organization into an auxiliary of the war effort, involved in medical support for the military and in some cases complicit in eugenics and concentration camp activities. Charles Edward, appointed president in 1933, had overseen this Nazification, aligning the organization with regime policies. The Katyn investigation was framed as a neutral inquiry, but it was orchestrated for propaganda purposes. Charles Edward contacted the International Committee of the Red Cross in Geneva, proposing a commission of forensic experts from neutral countries to examine the site. The ICRC, wary of being manipulated, agreed only if all parties, including the Soviets, consented, which they did not. Undeterred, the Nazis proceeded with their own international commission, comprising pathologists from occupied or allied nations, who confirmed Soviet responsibility. Charles Edward's involvement lent a veneer of legitimacy, as his aristocratic title and Red Cross position suggested impartiality. The involvement of the German Red Cross in Katyn was part of a broader pattern. Under Charles Edward, the DRK expanded to over 3 million members by 1943, providing medical aid to the military, but also enforcing Nazi racial policies such as denying care to Jews or undesirables. Charles Edward's leadership ensured alignment with the regime, including cooperation with the SS in occupied territories. The Katyn episode, while focused on exposing Soviet crimes, inadvertently highlighted the DRK's politicization, a fact that would contribute to Charles Edward's post-war denazification trials. Throughout World War II, Charles Edward's loyalty to the Nazi regime remained absolute, enduring personal losses and the war's escalating horrors without deviation. As president of the DRK, he oversaw operations that supported the Wehrmacht, including field hospitals, blood donation drives, and evacuation efforts. His position allowed him to travel extensively, inspecting facilities in occupied Europe and coordinating with military commanders. Despite the regime's atrocities, the Holocaust, forced labor camps, and mass executions, there is no record of Charles Edward expressing dissent or attempting to mitigate them. On the contrary, his speeches and actions consistently endorsed Hitler's policies, framing the war as a defensive struggle for German survival. By 1943, As Allied bombings intensified and the Eastern Front collapsed, many high-ranking Nazis began hedging their bets, destroying documents or seeking escape routes. Charles Edward, however, stayed the course. He remained in Gotha until the city's capture by American forces in April 1945, only fleeing briefly before surrendering. His final communications with Hitler expressed continued faith in victory, even as Berlin fell. This steadfastness can be attributed to a combination of ideological conviction, personal investment in the regime, and a sense of aristocratic duty. The Duke's family shared in this loyalty. His wife, Victoria Adelaide, and daughters supported war relief efforts through the DRK, while his surviving sons continued serving in the military. The family's estate in Gotha became a hub for Nazi social events, hosting figures like Hermann Göring and Joseph Goebbels. Charles Edward's unwavering stance, even after Hubertus's death, reflected a deep internalization of Nazi ideology, where personal sacrifice was seen as part of the greater racial and national struggle. Post-war, Charles Edward faced denazification proceedings. Classified as a major offender by American authorities, he was interned from 1945 to 1949, undergoing trials that examined his roles in the SA, NSKK, and DRK. He defended himself by claiming his positions were honorary and humanitarian, downplaying his involvement in propaganda like K-10. In 1949, a German court fined him heavily and confiscated properties, but he avoided prison due to health issues. He lived quietly in Coburg until his death in 1954, at age 69, maintaining to the end that his actions were driven by patriotism rather than fanaticism. The impact on his family was lasting. His descendants, including Prince Andreas of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, have grappled with the legacy, publicly condemning his Nazi involvement and supporting historical research. The duchy itself was abolished in 1918, but the family's properties and titles persist, shadowed by Charles Edward's wartime record. He spent his final years in isolation and relative poverty, living with his wife in a small cottage on the grounds of the castle he once owned. He was a ghost of a man, haunted by the wreckage of his life. On March 6, 1954, Charles Edward died of cancer at the age of 69. He was buried quietly in a forest cemetery near Kallenberg Castle. There was no royal pomp, no state funeral. The darling grandchild of Queen Victoria died in disgrace. The story of Charles Edward is a profound and unsettling tragedy. It is the story of a man whose identity was fractured at a young age, a man caught in the tectonic collision of two great nations. Was he simply a weak, impressionable man, a victim of the powerful personalities? First Queen Victoria, then Kaiser Wilhelm, and finally Adolf Hitler, who dominated his life? Or was he something more sinister, a willing participant, and man whose own deep-seated grievances and moral failings led him to embrace an ideology of pure hatred? His sister always believed he was a pawn, a man who stayed in Germany out of a misguided sense of duty to his family. But modern historians, armed with new evidence, paint a darker picture. They see him not as a naive victim, but as an active and enthusiastic supporter of Hitler, a man who shared his worldview and eagerly helped to legitimize his monstrous regime. He was, as one biographer described him, a second-tier perpetrator, not the architect of the Holocaust, but a man whose actions and influence helped enable it. Perhaps the most tragic element of his story is the loss of self. The sensitive English boy who was forced to become a German prince ended up as neither. He betrayed the country of his birth and was ultimately consumed by the evil of his adopted homeland. His life stands as a chilling warning about the dangers of nationalism, the corrupting nature of grievance, and the catastrophic consequences of a single human heart choosing the path of hatred over humanity. He was a prince who had everything and who threw it all away for a cause that represented the very worst of mankind.